Hello everybody, this is Unit 4, Horizons for Ethical Internationalization and Global Citizenship Education. This is the last lecture, the last unit of the course, and I would like to start this lecture with a story that for me illustrates the difficulties of naming the kinds of work and processes that we have tried to prompt in this course. So it was a conference in Calgary, an Indigenous conference, where the organizers had invited the whole community to be part of the conference. So we had elders, children, families, and some young men from the juvie also came to be part of the conference. And at lunchtime, they had their own table, and there was only one seat left, and they invited me to join them to talk during lunch. And I joined them, and there was a lot of interest in me because I was the only woman in that table. So they wanted to know my name and if I had finished school, if I worked, and then I said I work as a teacher, and they asked me if I worked in a primary school or a secondary school. I said no, I work at the university. And then there was more interest. So what do you do? What do you teach? And I then had to think on my feet and try to think about how to translate and explain what I do. Generally, when people ask me what I do, I don't even know how to start, right? So, and I was attentive to the audience too, because these young men know what the problems are, and they have been punished for thinking differently, for rejecting the system, for resisting the system, sometimes in harmful ways as well. But they do know what we're talking about, right? But it's just that translation between one context to the other that put me on the spot. So what I said was that I work with very privileged people in a very privileged context, and that I see my job as an educator as one that supports people to identify and remove the arrogance that they have inherited from the system in relating to the world and relating to each other and even seeing themselves in that system. So one of the young men looks at me and says, I know exactly what you do. And I thought, yeah, great. Tell me then what is it that I do? And then he said, you do and then I was expecting anti-racism, right? Or social justice education or something like that. And that's not what he said. What he said really surprised me. He said, you do anti-assholism education. And I thought that was great. I said, yes, that's a very good name. Thank you. And I said, in this work of anti-assholism starts with my own, because I'm part of the system, right? So I have to identify and try to remove my own assholism. And then he looked at me and he said, and now you're making me feel like one. And then I said, you see how good I am at my job? I'm very good. And then they all laughed, and it was a great way to start this conversation. But he also gave me a very good gift, which is this naming. And one day I think I'm going to have to write an article about anti-hassleism education, acknowledging the gift that he gave me. So this unit is about different kinds of framings of anti-hassleism education, or whatever you want to call it. But my idea for this unit was to gift you a few of the framings I've used before, so that they can inspire you to reframe these framings in different ways in your own contexts. So I hope you find it useful. So I would like to start with a visual that has helped me a lot articulate the difficulties of intervening with different communities that have different desires and that have different realms of intelligibility, how to translate between different realms. So this picture is the analogy of a beach, where you have some people just trying to put their toe in the water, really afraid of going in, people who are new to global citizenship or in internationalization, who need some very concrete things and simple things to start the process of losing that fear of the water. Then there are those who want to be past the breaking point of the waves, where it's easy to float and to bask in the sun. So those are the people who are looking for very manageable solutions to their problems, something that won't give them too much headache, and that something that's easy to implement, easy to evaluate, and that will make them feel comfortable and look like they're doing their jobs, basically. Then there are those who are ready to duck, to put their head in the water and to start to see some of the complexities of the solutions that we propose in this area. But they still want to be able to have their hands outside of the water so that they can swim up at any time, because they're still afraid of the murky waters that are close to the bottom. So the last group of people who are very like these are very small groups that are ready to dive, are ready to go into the murkiness without fear of losing jobs or not coming up with something concrete, who are ready to dive. And so I work with a very small group of people around the world, and we call this group we call our seminars, actually. The title of the seminars is Learning to Breathe Water, based on this analogy. And the idea here is that we go into something that is very tentative, very provisional, but that is not afraid of the depth of things. And we go without trying to instrumentalize the results. So we go trying not to think about what can I get out of it. We go together thinking we don't know what the result's going to be, but it's incredible that we always come back extremely inspired by what we find together and by each other, and that changes what we can do in all those different communities, those different levels of needs. So for us, we have been working together for about some of us for about 15 years. The group has grown a little bit larger in the last 5 years, and we do that as a means of professional development for ourselves, but also as a means to really shed our worries and have some time where we can explore things with each other, without the need to come up with something concrete to take back. So it's been very interesting and very useful to think about this metaphor, to this analogy, and to start to evaluate what kinds of needs the communities that come to us for consultancy or for advice, or even students, what kinds of needs they have in terms of their own contexts. So most of the work that I do is with the floating community, and in most of it is about trying to bring them to ducking, right? So you're floating, you think that everything's fine, so I'll start showing you some things that might disturb a little bit that comfort zone, and bring you to this invitation to put your head in the water and see that things are not necessarily as you thought they were. And then from there, it's an invitation into diving. So today, it's your invitation into diving. I'm going to show you some of the things that I've done tentatively with different communities and other groups that I work with, to frame and translate these things that we've been talking about in different contexts. And if you were looking for like one single bullet that could solve this, I'm really sorry, but this is not gonna happen. In every context, we will have to translate again and listen to the needs of each community, see where they're at in the conversation, and with a lot of compassion and generosity towards ourselves and towards the people we work with, we need to find ways of walking together differently. So the main topic of this last lecture is actually learning to walk together differently, because more important than what we say and what we do is the kinds of relationships that we build with each other, and interrupting the ways that we have learned to walk in this system that we live in, that is violent and unsustainable, is the most important thing, more than whatever kind of articulation that you have. You have to emanate what you're doing. And like, we can't do this all the time, because also we're part of the system. So colonialism, imperialism, they're just the air that we breathe. So But like having a commitment to unnumbing our other senses, to learning to do things in different ways, I think is the key message here. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the problems we have identified. So this is an outline or a synthesis of what we have talked about. So we have focused on the issue of epistemic arrogance, which is represented in the yellow corn cob and the single story of progress, development, and human evolution. And units 1, 2, and 3 did always go back to the same issue. And we also talked a little bit about the denial of complicity in harm. So this need for affirmation of benevolence and the desire that people have in the system to feel, look, and be seen as doing good. So that becomes a problem when you invite people to duck or to dive, because if they want to feel comfortable, they might resist that kind of learning. Then we talked about a lack of systemic and historical analysis of the production of inequalities. Generally, the simplistic way to talk about inequalities is to talk about lack of education, lack of information, or personal choices. So if there's a problem, for example, in terms of racism, it's because that individual is ignorant or has made wrong choices, instead of talking about it as a systemic issue that affects us all, and that is not so much about even cognitive frames. It's about relational frames, affective frames, and it's extremely difficult to interrupt. So we need deeper and more nuanced analysis of our relationships with each other, and how the distribution of wealth, labor, and value is constructed in the social hierarchies that the single story creates. Then we talked about the enduring imaginary, the enduring colonial imaginary, modern imaginary, but specifically this idea of forward, where forward is, and how social mobility has become the only story about the purpose of our existence. So the dream that we hear in this story is that everybody can and should belong to the middle class, and we forget here that the planet has limits. There are limits in terms of resources and in terms of the planet's capacity to absorb the waste produced by the middle classes, and also that the production of the middle class necessarily requires resources that are based on expropriation and violence towards other communities. So the kind of lifestyle we have is dependent on the sweat in the life of other communities. So the resources extracted from other people's lands, or the occupation of other people's lands, modern slavery, and dumping our waste on other people's places, and so on and so forth. So here we challenged a little bit the desire for this idea of a forward being social mobility. We didn't talk too much about Cartesian reasoning, but today I think we're going to touch a little bit more on that. So the Cartesian subject is known in the literature as one that is self-transparent, so that it can describe itself and that relates to the world through thinking. So it's I think, therefore I am, and whatever doesn't fit my thinking, then I can't relate to, because of that form of subjectivity. And there is a split between thought and emotion, mind and body, and so on and so forth. So from that kind of perspective, there is a very strong attachment to singular normative solutions. Right. So again, it's the single story, but it's our Cartesian subjectivities want the solution straight away, and they think in dialectical ways. So there's a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. It can't hold paradoxes in place. And so the course was trying to break that and to crack that Cartesian subjectivity in order to give us the stamina to hold paradoxes. And if you're coming from that perspective of a singular normative focus, you will have a very strong desire for a happy march towards better future. So let's fix this. Whereas when we are holding paradoxes and contradictions and complexities and nuances all together, the job is more like cleaning up the mess in the kitchen. So we have here two different approaches. One that is about finding a solution and moving forward, understanding that there is only one forward to move towards, and the other one is about saying, oh, where are we coming from here, and cleaning up the mess. There was also some conversations about relationships and the idea that if you're coming from a Cartesian orientation, your relationships are mediated by knowledge, identity, and understanding, rather than these visceral connections that we see in the literature, for example, on indigenous knowledges. And that literature says that, for example, we are always and have always been and will always be connected. There is no disconnection. The problem is that we have interrupted our sense of connection with each other, and we have become deluded with separability, that we think we are separate, and this is part of the Cartesian problem. So within this context, there is a huge problem of intelligibility, because we have been over socialized in Cartesian thinking and reasoning and being, and whatever is outside of this box is unintelligible. And even if we want to engage with these things that are unintelligible, what we often do is generally take something from that doesn't belong to the box and put it in the box, make it fit in the box, and then we think we already understand it, and we go back to this Cartesian way of even relating to indigenous knowledges or knowledges from divergent communities, because we really want to understand and move forward, right? So interrupting this desire to understand and move forward and establishing different terms for the creation of relationships based on our other senses is a priority here. And that's why when we talk about possible horizons, ethical solidarities is one of the key points, right? So in the text of Ruben Aston de Fernandez, you're going to explore a little bit more about this aspect. I'm not going to be talking too much about this right now. And then you can't have this relationship building without having looked at the critiques, the nuances, the complexities, and the messiness of the process. And Binaya Sabeti offers a framework for a decolonial approach to this issue. And I think the two texts together give us a lot to think about in terms of grounds for moving in different directions. But each one needs the other. I think one text needs the other to be able to address these different dimensions of what needs to be done, which is one related to relationships and existence in this world. The other one, it's politics and material circumstances and systems that reproduce violence and that make life for a lot of people impossible or very difficult. And my part of this today with you is to talk about this idea of walking together differently in a foggy road, right? So walking together differently could be about listening, engaging, tentatively framing, then failing and failing again, then learning from this failing, reframing, crying, laughing, singing, sharing, experimenting, stumbling, making mistakes, listening again, trying new clothes, getting naked, being undone, drumming, dancing, singing, resting, starting it all over again. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today in terms of the projects that I have been part of where all of this has happened and has happened with other people. So I'm going to be showing you some frames of this kind of education that we call different names. I'm really not very attached to how we call this, because I think as long as the work is done, you can call it whatever you like to call, which is a little bit counterintuitive to what we do in academia, which is about discussing definitions. And there is this fantasy that if only we got to the right definition of things and then put it in a policy, things would fall into place and people would just see the light. I don't think this is going to happen, because people look at words and they see what they're used to seeing. And if they are used to the single story, they're going to see the single story in what you present. So I think it's more complicated than that. And I think it requires a different way of being together and doing this work. So you'll see lots of different frames in different contexts. And I hope that because these are all provisional and precarious and always tentative, I think that these frames can, or perhaps inspire you to create your own frames and to walk in your context, designing what you need to design at the moment that you are asked to intervene in a good way, right? So the first project that I'm going to talk about is called OSDE, Open Spaces for Dialogue and Inquiry. And this resource specifically is going to be available for you on Connect, and it's also available online. And it was created from 2003, and it kind of got completed in 2006, but 2010 the website crashed. So, and we didn't revive the website because we thought it was time to move on with it. But it was a very popular resource in England, funded by the British government. And here is the how we framed the kind of education we were trying to promote with the resource. We talked about critical literacy in global citizenship education, and this critical literacy would be about expanding frames of reference, making connections, thinking historically and systemically, equipping people to make better informed and ethical decisions in face of complexity, uncertainty, plurality, contingency, inequality, and complicity in the reproduction of local and global injustices. So in this resource, we created global literacy inquiries, and these global literacies would be about identifying enduring and uneven structures, sociocultural hierarchies, historical patterns and conceptual frameworks affecting social relations, observing, mapping, and deconstructing responses to difficult and complex issues, which involve then formulating questions that prompt systemic analysis, examining the politics of knowledge production, power relations, and foreclosures, and learning to relate beyond the need for consensus, redemption, or scripts of identity. This was actually the most interesting and fun part of the process. We tried to create spaces where people could relate in these senses. So if you're interested in that, I do recommend you have a look at the resource and the kinds of processes and protocols and methodologies we created for creating spaces for that, both in primary schools, secondary schools, for teacher educators, and for university students. Now, from what we learned in this resource, in the creation of this project and this resource, we noticed that indigenous knowledge systems that are not anthropocentric, that do not place people at the center of the world, that place the land at the center of the world, were perspectives that people were not really familiar with. And we were thinking about how do we then create something, another project that introduces these perspectives in a rigorous way, right? In an ethical and rigorous way. So we applied again for funding, and as an offshoot of this project, the Through Other Eyes project came up, and we got funding for that. So this project was about the Millennium Development Goals, and we wanted to understand the Millennium Development Goals from indigenous perspective. So this resource is based on interviews with Maori, Chewa, Quechua, Guarani, and Australian Aboriginal educators. It presents different views on equality, poverty, development, and education. So there are units where we try to deconstruct um, uh, common assumptions about these concepts. And then there are critical examinations of interpretations of both Western and indigenous worldviews. So we were operating with a research team, and we were very concerned about not romanticizing or essentializing these communities at the same time that we were concerned about how to bring this knowledge at this interface between Western and non-Western knowledge systems to an audience that was not aware of the complexities and nuances of translating these issues. So the idea of this project is that indigenous knowledges is not cannot be seen as a substitute for what we have, but they inspire us to look at things more deeply, and they remind us that we can imagine very differently, that there are very diverse ways we can think about any concept. So we wanted people to understand that, to be invited to explore the contradictions and paradoxes of their own thinking in that sense. This is the pedagogical framework we used in this project through Other Eyes. And it consists of 4 ways of learning, or 4 spaces of learning. Learning to unlearn, learning to listen, learning to learn, and learning to reach out. So the framework was designed to help people open up to different ways of thinking, being, and knowing without assuming that they can understand it directly, or without reframing these things into frameworks that are familiar to them. So if you're interested in this kind of learning, I do recommend you have a look at the resource that is available both on Connect and on the internet. The next project is called Dispositions for Crossing Local Borders. And the drawing that you see in the middle is also part of how we used analogies to talk about these dispositions. So there are 2 things here about local borders. Borders in this project were conceptualized not just in terms of geographical terms. We were talking about borders in terms of emotional, intellectual borders, ideological borders, and they are both local and global. And these dispositions are things that we carry with us all the time. So it's not something that we move from one to the other. So they're very contextual, and they have different dimensions to them: relational dimensions, cognitive, affective. It's not just about thinking. So the first disposition that we have in the picture is the disposition of the fenced house, when you don't want to cross any border because you perceive a threat beyond the fence. So it can be a real threat, or a threat that is imagined, but the feeling that you have is that you cannot cross, you need to be protected. So the fence space is a disposition where you don't want to cross. The second disposition is the RV disposition, where you cross a border, but you cross it within the comforts of your RV. So you look at the world through the window of the RV, and the window actually reflects more of you than it reflects of the outside. But a lot of the people who travel on RVs feel that they are crossing, and that they really understand the terrains, the new terrains that they are walking or driving on, when in fact they are just protected within the comforts of their own home. They're bringing their home with them. The next disposition is a disposition of the tent, where you get out of the IV and you are on the ground, but you put up a tent and you're glamping. So you leave the door of the tent open, but you only welcome inside the tent that which is which fits within the frames, right? So you feel that you're open because you're on the ground and the door is open, but you want no mosquitoes or no dirty shoes inside. So again, you have your framework. It is more open than the RV, but you still feel that you can only relate to what feels comfortable to you. And then we have the disposition of the hat, the straw hat, which is open to the weather and to being undone by the rain. And in that case, you would need to weave the hat again, to sleeping in the outside. So in this disposition, we can relate to a world that is not definable and that affects you in multiple ways, and that it's a co-construction of the world that is never fixed. So it's a lot of fluidity. So you're comfortable with the discomfort that that creates. Now, when we talk about this disposition in this dispositions in this project, we say again that we carry these things with us all the time, right? But that education, Western education, and our systems of schooling only go up to the tent in terms of what they equip us to do, because for the hat to take place, we would need a different relationship to knowledge, a different understanding and relationship to knowledge and language. And so we are not socialized into the het disposition very much, into this disposition of disarmament, into a disposition of living in the world in a very different way, very similar to some philosophical traditions like Taoism, or some indigenous philosophies also go in the direction of not trying to put the world in a box, but being in the world with interrelated and interwoven with everything. So one of the things that we talk about in the project too is that in terms of global citizenship education and North-South relations, we have the RV, this predisposition to help others, this desire to help, of bringing whatever it is that you have at home to other people. The disposition of the tent is associated with inclusion, but inclusion on the terms of the people who put the tent up. And then the disposition of the het is associated with decentering. It's working with others in a much more, it's a humble way of approaching this kinds of relationship, not putting ourselves above or below others, but working in partnership and not needing to be at the center. So again, if you're interested, there's also the article available for you on Connect and on the internet. This next project is called Other Steps, and this is a collective of educators, artists, and activists that I support, and their thematic area is global education, and they want to make possible a kind of global education that prepares people to formulate different questions, forge new relationships, face difficult issues, and find different sources of joy in a planet facing multiple crises. So they propose transitional frames that can help learning communities to develop more complex, systemic, multi-layered, and multi-voiced social analysis that take us beyond simplistic solutions, to identify the origins and limits of dominant narratives, hierarchies, frames, and imaginaries, just like the other one that we saw, the first project that I showed. To expand our frames of reference, acknowledging the gifts, contradictions, and limitations of different knowledge systems, moving beyond either ors towards both and more. It's very much like Through Other Eyes. And to open the imagination to different forms of knowing and being, and to different futurities. So within this project, we use this cartography of epistemic spaces in a lot of the contexts that we work with, and it has been very useful so far. So we have three dimensions here represented as epistemic certainty, epistemic situatedness, and epistemic spectrum. So within epistemic certainty, we have two different spaces, a dualist space and a transitional space. Dualist space where things are right or wrong and black and white. Transitional space is where some things are right or wrong in black and white, other things are blurred, right? So people in the transitional space actually experience a lot of confusion. Then we have space 3 within epistemic situatedness, where things are relative. So everyone has their answer and everything is relative, and we operate in that kind of space. In space 4, which is different from space 3, is everything is contextual, everything is constructed, provisional, and context space. It's not that every answer is a good answer, but that answers, what is good and bad, is defined in context. Space 5 is a liminal space. And the focus here is on the limits of knowing. So you're sitting on that edge where it's very uncomfortable but can also be extremely generative. In space 6 is the pluriversal space where we go beyond meaning and understanding, and we can bring ourselves to a position of presencing um, different ways of knowing and being affected by different ways of being. So again, what we say here is that this is not a developmental model. We can be in each of these spaces in different minutes of the day or within the hour, and in relation to different subjects. So, but what we do say with this model is that epistemic certainty is the hallmark of our education system. That's what we are educated for. And we actually get children who may be in the epistemic spectrum when they are pre-literacy, and we force them into epistemic certainty. So unlearning epistemic certainty is extremely uncomfortable. The space of epistemic situatedness is also part of Western thought. So you have that in postmodernism, post-structuralism, post-humanism, but the epistemic spectrum space is something that we are only starting to touch in the Western tradition, but that is very much the hallmark and the key for many other traditions of philosophy and thinking that have been deemed inferior or backward in the single story for progress, development, and human evolution. So here you have a paradox that says that now that we need the epistemic spectrum to address the complex problems that we have in the world today that are global in scope, our Western system of education that has socialized most people in the world by now in its imperial drive has created a barrier because people are looking now for epistemic certainty and have lost this other or not, if not lost, now we have diminished the voice and the power of other traditions to challenge that. So we have used this, for example, with maths teachers talking about the importance of epistemic spectrum within maths. And we have found many, actually, teachers who are very passionate about mathematics. There's one actually in the curriculum studies department here at UBC who see math as a discipline that is based on uncertainty, actually, and that play with math in a very different way, and who are very frustrated that people have been teaching math and want math to fit the space of epistemic certainty. So this has been a very interesting process. And you also have on Connect the draft document where we have some examples of transitional frames of this project, other steps for you to look at on the website if you're interested. Then we have Through the Eyes of Ancestors, which is a project that is funded by SSHRC, and it is led by Kesha Henneque, who's also at Educational Studies at UBC. And this project focuses on planetary challenges and horizons for education based on relational ontologies. So these are ontologies not based on Enlightenment or Cartesian principles. They are non-anthropocentric, and they are on the whole, they think about our the ways in which we are interwoven with each other is the priority in this relational approach. So we have in this project interviews with elders on ceremonial sites. So the idea here is to honor this insight that the land can imagine through us, that our intellects are limited in dealing with the issues that we have to deal with in education. We have to be present to other insights coming from other sources. In the base literature of this project includes Buen Vivir, which is an Andean philosophy, Amazonian perspectivism, Ubuntu, Aboriginal Dreamtime, Gift, which is a Sami perspective, and Plains philosophies, which are Blackfoot and Cree. And the icon for this project is this picture of 4 mountains. So you see 3 on the foreground and 1 in the background. And this drawing was based on a story told by Elder John Cryer. And we have the permission to retell the story. And of course, I'm not going to do justice to the story, but the context of the story is that we asked these different elders what education was for, and the recurrent response that we had was that education from these perspectives is about supporting people to become good elders. So it's not about finding a job, it is about becoming good elders for all relations, which means beyond your bloodlines and beyond the human species as well. So the 4 mountain story refers to that objective of education. And this story is about this first mountain, which is the baby mountain, which is the mountain where we need somebody to hold our hand so that we can stand and learn to use our bodies. The second mountain is called the warrior mountain, where I think it's equivalent to our teenage years, where John said we get lost in the forest in the dark to figure out who we are, but it's the trees who know who we are, and we think we do, but not really, and we can't listen to the trees because we're very stubborn and angry. So we try to fight the shadows of the trees, yeah, while the trees are trying to tell us who we are, so, and what our contribution to the community is. So in this warrior mountain, we figure out what our contribution to the community is. The third mountain is the hunter mountain, where we figured that out already, what our contribution is, and we use our skills to feed the community and to bring balance and to raise families and to just to be part of and to nourish, right, the collectivity. So when we finish the work on the Hunter Mountain, we go to the last mountain, which is the Elder Mountain. And he said that, number one, our bodies cannot finish climbing this mountain because they are too heavy. So in the middle of this mountain, we lose our bodies so that we can climb to the top. And as we lose our bodies, we can look at the 3 mountains that we have left behind and see that we were never alone. Our ancestors have always been with us. Our ancestors are not just those who have been before us, but also those yet to come. And he also said that this mountain is the mountain that touches the baby mountain. And this is very important. And that's why in his philosophy, in the Cree philosophy, it's important for children, young children, to have contact with their elders, because the elders are the ones who have the wisdom of the 3 other mountains. So they have both the patience that the warriors lack and the time that the hunters lack to be able to hold the hand of this child so that she can learn to use this body. So I think it's a beautiful story that gives us a framework and a way of thinking about life that is missing actually in our schooling system, that is now about making money or finding a job and not being a burden on the state. Whereas this one is about our responsibilities and obligations to one another, to those who have come before and those who are yet to come. So we use that picture in this project. And another thing that we did in this project was to ask the elders what the problem with our current context was and how to solve it, right? So again, what we've been told is based on the medicine wheel, which is the circle in the middle of this 4-dimensional drawing. And the medicine wheel says we have a spiritual dimension, a cognitive dimension, a physical dimension, and an affective dimension. So these elders pointed to the fact that there is an imbalance in this dimension. So in the spiritual imbalance causes disappointment and this sense of void and emptiness that we feel. Imbalance in the cognitive realm, we have poor decisions and arrogance. In the affective realm, we have a feeling of disconnect and self-exile. This feeling of self-exile can lead to depression, anxiety, and high levels of self-harm and even suicide. And in the physical realm, we have low life force that leads us to addiction, trying to find the energy to deal with our problems through shortcuts. So when we asked them about how to solve these issues, we also were surprised by the answers. So the spiritual realm needs to be solved with more silence. We need more silence, and we need to learn how to be present to ourselves and to this idea of the divine. In terms of the cognitive realm, we need better stories. Our stories are are narrowing the possibilities that we have for existence. In the affective realm, we need more presence. We need to be present to each other. That means we need to unnumb our senses to feel our connections with each other. And in the physical realm, we need more resonance. So, in one of the elders' perspective, it was we need to be in the rhythm with the earth and with the rhythms of healing. So drumming was very important. Singing was very important. And what we noted when we were doing this research was that if you ask through the Western tradition about global citizenship education, for example, how can we solve the problems? You will get a lot of dialogue. We need more dialogue. Here, dialogue was a fourth of the process, right? So it's only in the better stories. And it doesn't even talk about us telling each other about our stories. We just need better stories, better blueprints for how we can live our lives. And apart from that, we need silence, presence, and resonance, which was really interesting. Very different way of solving the problems. So based on that, we have created this comparison between enlightenment-based ontologies and its approach to global citizenship. So enlightenment-based ontologies are about individual freedoms, autonomy, expression. They are anthropocentric. They are Cartesian. They are based on Cartesian utility, maximizing rationality. Whereas relational, non-anthropocentric ontologies are based on radical interdependence, visceral relationality, reciprocity. They are land-centered. They are non-dialectical or teleological. Teleological is that they don't need to see the future in order to arrive there. They are much more about working in the relationships in the present. And we compare here what Enlightenment ontologies say about the approach to global citizenship or global change and relational ontologies. So while Enlightenment ontologies talk about empowerment, relational ontologies talk about disarmament. While Enlightenment ontologies talk about leadership, relational ontologies talk about decentering. So instead of consensus, we have pluriversalities. Instead of progress, we have remembering, both in the sense of remembering as associated with memory, but also in terms of remembering the dismembered bodies, our dismembered collective bodies, and reattaching what has been dismembered before. Instead of national identity, we have planetarity, the idea that the Earth is our home and it's one, and there are about 7 billion people over here. How is it that we can live together in a good way? Instead of dialogue, we have presencing to each other, which in many cases involves shutting up and being with each other. Instead of innovation, we have wisdom. Instead of affluence, we have a giveaway, the idea that accumulation goes counter to the intent of sharing a planet and of sharing our lives. And instead of competition, complementarity. So, in understanding that we are all insufficient and indispensable to this collectivity. So when we talk about this, we don't say one is better than the other. We need relational ontologies instead of enlightenment ontologies. Enlightenment ontologies are teaching us things, right? The problem with enlightenment ontologies is that they become the only thing that we are taught. So when people ask me, oh, so you don't want your children to have access to Cartesian ways of knowing, which are all around us, and I say, of course I do want them to be able to operate in Cartesian ways. Cartesian ways have given us enormous gifts, including like airplanes, but do I want my children to have access only to that? And the answer is no. I want my children to have access to a spectrum of different things, and when we narrow it down to only one way of being, one form of existence, that's where the problem is. So from there, the next project is called The Eye of the Storm. And this is a project with the community that I told you about in the beginning, the people who work with learning to breathe water. And Eye of the Storm is based on this drawing where you have a storm. We have two different forces. One force of the system that we have right now, and another force, another semicircle of the system that is being born. So we have in the middle of the circle this interface between what's dying and what's being born, and there's a storm there. So the eye of the storm is the middle of that interface in the middle of the storm. So one process in relation to what the system that is dying, we call it hospicing. So our responsibility towards the system is to allow it to die with dignity. And our responsibility towards the system that is being born is one of midwifery, of allowing it, enabling it to come to the world without over determining it, without saying it's a boy, it's a girl, it's going to be a doctor or a teacher. No, it's going to be itself, and we are here to support its arrival and the well-being of the family that brought it into being. So on the hospicing side, the hospicing process involves two things, we say: intellectual accountability and existential surrender, which we associate with discerning and disarming. So in the education of the eye of the storm is about discerning, disarming. And then on the other side, the midwifery part is about existential accountability and intellectual surrender, which is about decentering and dissociating. Dissociating means learning to take a step back from how we identify or disidentify with the world, and understand these identifications and disidentifications as ecological processes. So ecological processes, if they're driving our attachments to the world and investments in the world, they are still part of the system that is dying. So we need to learn to detach from the system and understand our existence in much more open ways. And this is the place where the land imagines through us, and where we can be in a collective mind. So the eye of the storm is the education exactly at that point in the middle. And if we walk too fast in this education, we get caught in the storm. If we walk too slow, we get caught in the storm. So we have to walk with the storm itself. So we don't determine the pace of this walk, which for educators is socialized in the system. It's insane, right? It's not what we're trained to do. But we need to be patient, we need to be present, and we need to be practicing these things if we want to take education to somewhere different. So this is one of the projects that's trying to do that. So again, just to recap, intellectual accountability is about discerning, which is about facing our violent systems and our positions within it, addressing our denial of the harm that we cause, or our complicity in harm. It is about sitting at the edge of existing knowledge systems, so using reason to take us to the edge of reason, to the limits of reason. Existential surrender is about disarming, unnumbing to the collective pain, relating beyond identity, knowledge, and understanding. Existential accountability is about decentering, taking infinite responsibility for our collective entanglement, including both the pain and the joys of being together. And interwoven with each other. And intellectual surrender is about dissociating from ecological framings, allowing the land to imagine through us. So from this project, other projects have come up, and one of them is this framework for a project called Uniceres in Brazil. Uniceres is a project committed to intercultural and international, transnational encounters, and they bring people from the global south to the global, they bring people from the global north to the global south for experiences with social movements, of study abroad programs that are extremely different from anything that I've seen so far. And their framework, they have adopted this idea of walking together differently. So they say that walking together means walking together, questioning, discovering and rediscovering through lived experiences and reflexivity, new ways of living and being in the world, outside of the classroom, with people who have struggled against state and corporate violence, exploitation, and individualistic metropolitan consumerism. It's based on ethical, ecological, and social educational processes that enable people to embrace both accountability and surrender in their intellectual and existential dimensions. So it goes back to Eye of the Storm. Learning to be intellectually accountable and to surrender existentially to new forms of relationships and desires. So the project is about focusing on the direct relationship between material and existential forms of poverty. It's committed to alleviating the effects of both poverties and to tackling their causes. So I think this is very interesting in this project, that they do have this distinction between existential poverty and material poverty, in that our job is to alleviate the effects and to tackle the causes. So no pity, no charity, no guilt, no experts, no saviors, no missionaries, just fellow travelers on the same planet or boat, already experiencing disaster due to our entrapment in limited cognitive frames and harmful desires. So this project here draws a lot on the discussions we have had so far, and they're experiencing it in practice. Also from Brazil, we have the project of UNILA, and you have seen a little bit of that in the reading of Unit 2. This was an exercise I did with some people from UNILA, trying to rethink their internationalization strategy. So we were thinking about internationalization otherwise. This doesn't have the force of policy yet. This was just thinking of these faculty members of UNILA. And we were talking about a kind of internationalization that is not for income supplementation. It's not to compensate state defunding of higher education. It's not about the economy of prestige. It's not about the CV or recentering the Western subject. It's not about expansion of competitive capitalism. It's not about capital for social mobility. But it is for a gift economy of solidarity, this idea of walking together, addressing the harm created by the single story of development. It's about collaboration on social issues, learning from recurrent mistakes everywhere, and it's about the pluralization of futures beyond the consolidation of financial capitalism. And this kind of internationalization has three dimensions. We were thinking at the time. We need to look at the past. We need to learn from colonial and neo-colonial bio and geopolitical economies of knowledge production. For example, linguistic imperialism, cognitive imperialism, political and existential imperialism, and their effects, seeing violence as constitutive rather than derivative of modernity, and the idea of hospicing rather than inclusion or emancipation from modernity. In relation to the present, we need to learn from the dynamics of neoliberalism and its resistance, and think about this pendulum between the uncritical celebration and perceived separation of the market and of the state. We need a deeper analysis of the symmetries and the asymmetries of local and global struggles, interrogating and interrupting the imperative for social mobility and affluence. And in terms of the future, we need to learn to pluralize the future by pluralizing the present, disinvesting in the desires that structures the current system, like consumerism, individualism, narcissism, hedonism, progressivism, and innocent Western subjectivities, control, certainty, and comfort. So it was a very good conversation. We haven't written about this in an article yet. And what they were saying was that we need this for UNILA. It's not there yet. And UNILA as a project is very complex. UNILA is the University for the Integration of Latin America. And they're finding lots of difficulties in implementing different ideals of internationalization. And they're emphasizing this idea that we need more education that gestures towards different horizons. So my last piece of advice in this last lecture, is that I wish you can experiment with walking differently, and walking differently means being open to and not afraid of critique, failure, complexity, contradictions, paradoxes, uncertainty in a world that does not fit in any box. And this means having your eyes, your pores, your skin, your flesh, your heart, your guts, your hands, and your dreams wide open. So I wish you all the best in your journey. And if you feel compelled to be connected to this kind of education that we're promoting here, that might not be for every context, but we're trying to amplify its voice, you're very welcome to be in contact with these groups that I work with, and to have our support also in trying it out in your own context. I do hope that the course has been useful, and that it has given you ideas that you can try in your own context. Thank you very much. See you at the tutorial.